Give one or two examples. Cellier, the senior associate judge of the tribunal, appears to have been a good lawyer and a fairly worthy man. One day in February 1794, Cellier was at dinner with Robespierre, when Robespierre complained of the delays of the court. Cellier replied that without the observance of forms there could be no safety for the innocent. "Bah!" replied Robespierre, "you and your forms! Wait! Soon the committee will obtain a law which will suppress forms, and then we shall see." Cellier ventured no answer. Such a law was drafted by Couthon and actually passed on 22 Prairial, June 10, 1794, and yet it altered little the methods of Fouquier Tinville as prosecuting officer. Cellier having complained of this law of Prairial to Saint Just replied that if he were to report his words, or that he was flinching, to the committee, Cellier would be arrested. As arrest was tantamount to sentence of death, Cellier continued his work. Without reasoning the subject out logically from premise to conclusion, or being of course capable of doing so in the mass, Frenchmen had collectively received the intuition that everything must be endured for a strong government, and that whatever obstructed the government must be eliminated. For the process of elimination they used the courts. Under the conditions in which they were placed by the domestic enemy, they had little alternative. If a political party opposed the dictatorship in the Convention, that party must be broken down. If a man seemed likely to become a rival for the dictatorship, that man must be removed. All who conspired against the Republic must be destroyed as ruthlessly at home as on the battlefield. The Republic was insolvent and must have money, as it must have men. If the government needed men, it took them all. If it needed money and a man were rich, it did not hesitate to execute him and confiscate his property. There are very famous examples of all these phenomena strewn through the history of the Terror. The Girondists were liberals. They always had been liberals. They had never conspired against the Republic, but they were impracticable. The ablest of them, Vergniaud, complained before the Tribunal that he was being tried for what he thought, not for what he had done. This the government denied, but it was true. Nay, more, he was tried not for positive, but for negative opinions, and he was convicted and executed, and his friends were convicted and executed with him, because, had they remained in the Convention, the dictatorship, through their opposition, would have lost its energy. Also the form of the conviction was shocking in the extreme. The defense of these 21 men was practically suppressed, and the jury were directed to bring in a verdict of guilty. Still the prosecutions of the Girondists stopped here. When they refrained from obstruction they were spared. Danton and his friends may have been, and probably were, whether intentionally or by force of circumstances, a menace to the dictatorship. Either Robespierre or Danton had to be eliminated. There was not room for both. On April 1, 1793, Danton, Camille Desmoulins, and others were arrested on a warrant signed by such men as Cambacérès, Carnot, and Prieur. Carnot in particular was a soldier of the highest character and genius. He would have signed no such warrant had he not thought the emergency pressing. Nor was the risk small. Danton was so popular and so strong before a jury that the government appears to have distrusted even Fouquier Tinville, for an order was given and held in suspense, apparently to Henriot, to arrest the president and the public prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal on the day of Danton's trial. Under such a stimulant Fouquier did his best, but he felt himself to be beaten. Examining Cambon, Danton broke out: "Do you believe us to be conspirators? Look, he laughs, he don't believe it. Record that he has laughed." Fouquier was at his wits' end. If the next day the jury were asked if they had heard enough and they answered no, there would be an acquittal, and then Fouquier's own head would roll into the basket. Probably there might even be insurrection. Fouquier wrote to the committee that they must obtain from the Convention a decree silencing the defense. So grave was the crisis felt to be that the decree was unanimously voted. When Fouquier heard that the decree was on its way, he said, with a sigh of relief, "Faith, we need it." But when it was read, Danton sprung to his feet, raging, declaring that the public cried out treason upon it. The president adjourned the court, while the hall resounded with the protests of the defendants and the shouts of the police as they tore the condemned from the benches which they clutched and dragged them through the corridors toward the prison. They emerged no more until they mounted the carts which took them to the scaffold. Nor was it safe to hesitate if one were attached to this court. Fouquier had a clerk named Paris Fabricius. Now Paris had been a friend of Danton and took his condemnation to heart. He even declined to sign the judgment which it was his duty to do. The next day when he presented himself to Fouquier, Fouquier looked at him sourly and observed, "We don't want men who reason here. We want business done." The following morning Paris did not appear. His friends were disturbed, but he was not to be found. He had been cast into a secret dungeon in the prison of the Luxembourg. So, if a man were too rich it might go hard with him. Louis Philippe Joseph, Duc d'Orléans, afterwards known as Égalité, was one of the most interesting figures among the old nobility. The great-great-great-grandson of Louis XIII, he was a distant cousin of Louis XV, and ranked as the first noble of France beyond the royal family. His education had been unfortunate. His father lived with a ballet dancer, while his mother, the Princess Henriette de Bourbon Conti, scandalized a society which was not easily shocked. During the Terror, the sans-culottes everywhere averred that the Duke was the son of a coachman in the service of the banker Durouet. Doubtless this was false, but the princess had abundant liaisons, not much more reputable. Left to himself at 16 years old, Égalité led a life of extreme profligacy, but he married one of the most beautiful and charming women of the age, whom he succeeded in inspiring with a devoted affection. Born in 1747, his father died in 1785, leaving him, just at the outbreak of the Revolution, the master of enormous wealth, and the father of 3 sons who adored him. The eldest of these was the future king, Louis Philippe. The man must have had good in him to have been loved as he was throughout life. He was besides more intelligent touching the Revolution and its meaning than any man approaching him in rank in France. The Duke, when a young man, served with credit in the navy, but after the battle of Ushant in 1778, where he commanded the Blue Squadron, he was received with such enthusiasm in Paris that Marie Antoinette obtained his dismissal from the service. From this period he withdrew from court and his opposition to the government began. He adopted republican ideas which he drew from America, and he educated his children as democrats. In 1789 he was elected to the States General, where he supported the fusion of the orders, and attained to a popularity which, on one occasion, according to Madame de Campan, nearly made the Queen faint from rage and grief. It was from the garden of his palace of the Palais Royal that the column marched on July 14, wearing his colours, red, white, and blue, to storm the Bastille. It seemed that he had only to go on resolutely to thrust the king aside and become the ruler of France. He made no effort to do so. Mirabeau is said to have been disgusted with his lack of ambition. He was charitable also, and spent very large sums of money among the poor of Paris during the years of distress which followed upon the social disorders. The breach with the court, however, became steadily wider, and finally he adhered to the party of Danton and voted for the condemnation of the king. He sent 2 of his sons to serve in the army. The elder was still with Dumouriez at the time of his treason. On April 6, 1793, and when Dumouriez's treachery had become known, the Assembly ordered the arrest of the whole Bourbon family, and among them the Duke was apprehended and sent to Marseilles. Thus it appeared that whatever complaint his own order may have had against Égalité, the Republic certainly had none. No man could have done more for modern France than he. He abandoned his class, renounced his name, gave his money, sent his sons to the war, and voted for his own relative's death. No one feared him, and yet Robespierre had him brought to Paris and guillotined. His trial was a form. Fouquier admitted that he had been condemned before he left Marseilles. The Duke was, however, very rich, and the government needed his money. Every one understood the situation. He was told of the order for his arrest one night when at supper in his palace at Paris with his friend Monsieur de Monville. The Duke, much moved, asked Monville if it were not horrible, after all the sacrifice